Good afternoon. I'm Paul DiRienzo, host of The Torch. House Democrats are preparing another public rebuke of Minnesota Democrat Representative Ilhan Omar after weeks of controversy surrounding alleged anti-Semitic remarks by the Congresswoman. On Monday, reports from Washington said top Democrats in the House were considering a vote this week on a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. A draft of the resolution obtained by the New York Times does not mention Omar by name, but appears targeted at her recent remarks and their fallout. Omar responded to a tweet from journalist Glenn Greenwald, who posted about the House GOP leader Kevin McCarthy threatening to punish Omar and other congresswomen for being critical of Israel. Omar wrote back, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," a line about a $100 bill from a Puff Daddy song. Critics jumped off the tweet and said Omar was calling up negative and harmful stereotypes of Jewish Americans. In another tweet soon after, Omar named the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, saying it was funding Republican support for Israel. This tweet received bipartisan backlash, and Omar was widely accused of anti-Semitic speech. Omar apologized and said she was learning about the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes, but held on to her criticism of AIPAC's lobbying. The latest controversy comes from Omar's remarks at a Washington bookstore called Busboys and Poets last week. The comment in question refers to the weeks of controversy that followed Omar's earlier criticism. She said, "I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. I want to ask why it is okay for me to talk about the influence of the NRA, National Rifle Association, of fossil fuel industries or Big Pharma, and not talk about a powerful lobbying group that is influencing policies." Again, Omar was accused of anti-Semitism. Jacob Bacharach is a Jewish-American author based in Pittsburgh. He wrote an op-ed today on the website truthdig.com saying the criticism of the left for anti-Semitism has become its own dog whistle.
I just see a political habit in American politics and media of greater scrutiny to rhetoric on the left, particularly surrounding Jewish issues and the state of Israel, than you'll see from rhetoric on the right.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. I've actually felt it myself. If you compare something Trump does to fascism, or say the optics of putting children in a camp remind one of maybe the early days of the Nazi regime, everybody's jumping on your back like you said the worst thing in the world, and yet it doesn't seem that way when you look back on it. What is that all about?
No, and actually, that's probably a pretty good example, because there as well you'll see that there's a fairly broad swath of conservative commentary that effectively accuses not just the left in the United States, but even mainstream liberalism of basically being Stalinists. And you rarely see the kind of round condemnation of that sort of rhetoric as you do of people saying, well, yeah, Trump appears to be sort of maybe proto-fascist, if not actually fascist.
Right. What's behind all that? How, and why do they get away with it?
Well, I tend to think that most of the sort of legacy press in the United States is just unduly deferential to the political right in general, and I think that is the result of a combination of things. One is just the fact that the right have been effectively working the rest by complaining about media bias to anyone who will or won't listen for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and I think that has an impact on the way that news and current events are covered. But I think that part of it, too, is the fact that while it's fair to say that a lot of reporters and journalists have some cultural liberal biases, they are, at the end of the day, largely professional people in the United States. They identify with the relatively well-to-do professional classes and tend to be actually more conservative in their outlook, I believe, than the sort of mainstream criticism of the media as being the sort of hotbed of liberalism would have you believe.
And Representative Omar, what she said, well, tropes. I mean, how can you say anything that's not a trope, but yet the President of the United States said that a bunch of people screaming the Jews will not replace us were fine people, although he tries to hedge on that nowadays. He's had he used on his own campaign literature really anti-Semitic tropes that were like right in your face. forget exactly what it was, but I remember it was something on his campaign literature, and he'd never apologized to it. And then also, he was friends with a neo-Nazi down in Louisiana, political David Duke, who's well-known neo-Nazi, refused to apologize.
Yeah, I mean,
you say Benjamin, and everybody's on your back for that.
Well, I mean, there again, I think that it seems to me that the Trump White House and that larger political movement has quite evidently cozied up in many ways to these characters on the sort of extreme right, far right, alt-right, whatever term you want to use for it, who have explicit anti-Semitic biases, but who in some very interesting ways tend to sort of check those biases at the water's edge. In fact, if you look at characters who have been broadly supportive of Trump, even though he himself has not explicitly embraced them, and that would be people like, say, Richard Spencer, who sort of construct themselves as ethno-nationalists, white nationalists, they have actually praised Israel, even as they sort of revel in anti-Semitism. They say, Israel is a good example of exactly the type of sort of mono-ethnic state that they want, and so there's an interesting contradiction there where the sort of circle gets squared by this political movement permits both a sort of fairly virulent anti-Semitism toward Jews and the Jewish people, even as it really presents itself as being sort of hardline in support of Israel as a political entity.
And of course, there's the evangelical Christians who have almost like a dark vision where Israel's at the heart of it.
We're like the primer switch before they actually pull the ripcord and start up the apocalypse, and it's always struck me as being one of the dumbest strategic moves that conservative Jews and many American Jewish supporters of Israel, and frankly many Israelis as well, have made, which is to sort of ally themselves in this sort of common cause of convenience with American right-wing evangelicals who have really a pretty deranged notion of what Israel is and represents on the world stage, and a really questionable reason for quote-unquote supporting Israel.
Are you aware at all, can you tell us, enlighten us what people in Israel think about what they hear when they hear this stuff in the United States? The middle class, people who aren't extremists one way or the other, just were born there and live there.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I would say that, the majority of my Israeli friends and acquaintances come from the dwindling Israeli political left, and they tend to look askance at a lot of this stuff the same way that many leftists in the United States do. But as I said, regrettably, it seems to me, and this is as an American and as an outside observer, I'll include that caveat, that not just Israeli politics in the form of the government, the Netanyahu government, but Israeli society in general, more and more politically, culturally, and socially right-wing, and frankly has embraced not just Trump, but a number of other far-right characters in governments throughout the world. Jair Bolsonaro down in Brazil, Viktor Orban, until a recent flap, even sort of cozied up to the right-wing government in Poland, although there's been some flaps that have seemed to have driven a little bit of a wedge in that relationship now. So, I think that there's a really stark divide in Israeli politics, as there is here, between those on the left who, want to see some fairly radical changes in the pursuit of peace and equity, and unfortunately what appears to be, if not a majority, at least a very strong plurality in that society, and as reflected in their politics, that has no particular interest in any type of peace, whether a negotiated two-state solution or some type of one-state solution, as people increasingly talk about, but are simply seeking to delay until eventually, I guess in their minds, the Palestinians give up their sort of legitimate aspirations to freedom and statehood of their own.
It seems to be a reliance on the massive military might represented by a U.S.-Israeli alliance in this region. All we have to do is just keep the road, and eventually our money and our power, and we're talking about the United States here, will win.
Yeah, and actually I think that's an important point, and it's one that I like to emphasize, which is that I actually do think that the one, so if we're talking about anti-Semitic tropes, I think that one of the problematic things that you do sometimes hear on the American left in particular are people sort of insinuating that Israel, through the lobbying power of AIPAC and through its own sort of nefarious political influence is sort of Svengali-like controlling the government of the United States, when in reality I think that we, really have to confront the fact that Israel is a client state of the United States, and that far more than the American government somehow doing the bidding of Israel, Israel, like many American client states, is really acting in a way that supports larger imperial American foreign policy. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, because I do think that we trip into dangerous territory when we begin to suggest that, this relatively tiny state in the Middle East is sort of exerting undue control over the vastly more powerful and influential American government. I think that rather it's no less troubling, but sort of vice versa.
Should we give credit to the Tsarist government for coming up with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most amazing, effective racist tropes in history, still to this day?
Well, yes, well, I mean...
It's right you can buy it on the streets of New York. I'm in Brooklyn right now. I can walk down the street and buy one in 5 minutes.
You can find them in used bookstores. It's pretty incredible how durable that's been. Unfortunately, as I said in the piece that I published today, how a legitimate sensitivity to the sort of slightest hint of anti-Semitism, which is a sensitivity that I understand as a person and as a Jewish person, can be utilized so effectively in the case of Representative Omar, for example, to really shut down legitimate political discourse and legitimate criticism, not just of the State of Israel itself, but in her case, if you look carefully at what she said, of the expectations of representatives here in the United States and of the expectations of what they support and believe in terms of American foreign policy. And I keep coming back to that because I think that that's really the fundamental issue in this debate here, is
right.
That at the end of the day, we're talking about American foreign policy.
And that's what she's bringing up. So do you think that generally her statements, although they're getting so many attacks, they're actually legitimate statements she's making?
Yeah, I mean, I think that she has. I think that she has spoken somewhat inartfully. I will say that, and I think that is a legitimate critique. I think that oversensitivity on these issues is regrettable but understandable. And again, I say that as a Jewish person who has some of those oversensitivities myself. But I think that the fundamental underlying points that she's making are correct, and I think that she is being deliberately interpreted in the most uncharitable possible light by people who are opportunistically seeking to score points for their own political ends.
Great. Thank you very much. Maybe, is there any hope, that this whole situation, not just Omar, but, can we ever come to some, or is things heading down the rabbit hole right here?
Well, I tend generally to be a pessimist, but let me try to end on a hopeful note here. Yes, I actually do think that what we have seen over the last several weeks, and in fact with some of the new leftists who are coming into power and into prominence in the Congress and in political movements across the United States, is at least a slight loosening of the extremely constricted rhetoric around issues of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, and that many things that previously had been totally unutterable are at least now being slightly debated within the public square. I think we have a very, very long way to go, but if I have to end on a hopeful note, that's my hopeful note.
Jacob Bacharach is a Jewish-American author based in Pittsburgh. The United States House of Representatives passed a bill on Thursday condemning anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim statements. The hotly debated legislation passed after nearly a full day of debate and several draft versions by a vote of 407 to 23. The bill was originally introduced to slam comments made by Minnesota Democrat Ilhan Omar, but soon became a heated argument over U.S. support for Israel. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said it was important not to give the impression that the House was slamming freedom of speech.
And then we see people making attacks on each other throughout the country, whether it's in Charlottesville or whether it's anti-immigrant attitudes that have reared their ugly heads in our country. And it is in that spirit that I come to the floor almost emotionally to speak about this. In the Congress and across the country, we must accept debate on any subject in a legitimate way, whether it's on our U.S.-Israel policies and the rest. That is protected by the value of free speech and democratic debate in the United States and in Israel. Israel is our friend and our friend in that region. We support Israel out of friendship, out of shared values, but also because it is in our national interest to do so. But not every one of us in this body agrees on every provision of our or any consideration in that relationship. That's a separate and complete issue from anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, whether it's an form of attacks on Jewish people, anti-Semitic tropes, prejudicial accusations, or any other form of hatred, is deeply and unequivocally offensive and must be condemned wherever it is heard. And all of us must remember, as members of Congress, as President of the United States, that our words are weightier once we cross the threshold into Congress, and indeed they weigh a ton when someone becomes the President of the United States. It's also disturbing that Islamophobia and white supremacism remain a sinister and shameful presence in America today. Too often that goes under-noticed or unchecked. Such attacks are even targeted some of us in this body. We must condemn these attacks and confront them. As members of Congress and Americans, we have a solemn, urgent responsibility to fight to end the scourge of bigotry, racism, and hatred in our country.
Representative Cedric Richmond of Louisiana quoted an associate of Reverend Martin Luther King on the subject of hate fueling violence through speech.
But in the eulogy for Dr. King, Dr. Benjamin E. Mays blamed in part the American people for the assassination. He pointed out that the assassin heard enough condemnation of Dr. King and of Negroes to feel that he had public support. So when Dylann Roof murdered 9 worshipers in Charleston, he thought he had public support. The shooter at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh thought he had public support. The neo-Nazis and the white nationalists who marched in Charlottesville thought they had public support. The shooter of Gabby Giffords thought he had public support. The shooter of Steve Scalise thought he had public support. What we're doing here today is making it unequivocally clear to the public that no one has the support to engage in discrimination and racism and anti-Semitism. But Dr. Mays went on to challenge us as Americans to do better. He said, we, and not the assassin, represent America at its best. He said, we have the power, not the prejudice, not the bigoted, not the anti-Semite, not the assassin, to make things better. So we too in Congress have the power and the obligation to make things right. Though we come from dramatically diverse backgrounds, and though we have lived very different lives.
President Trump tweeted Thursday morning that he believed it was shameful the House bill did not focus on anti-Semitism in reference to the addition of anti-Muslim hatred and bigotry against minorities into the legislation. end. In the summer of 2018, as protests against the Trump administration immigration policies intensified and the movement to abolish ICE gained momentum, the federal agency at the center of the storm was keeping tabs on a series of anti-Trump protests in New York City. According to documents obtained by The Nation via Freedom of Information Act request, among the protests the agency tracked were several promoting immigrants' rights and opposing the administration's deportation policies, as well as one protesting the National Rifle Association. One event was organized by a sitting member of Congress. Lee Rowland is policy director of the New York Civil Liberties Union and an expert on civil rights.
The Nation has uncovered a document showing that ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, has kept at least one spreadsheet tracking anti-Trump protests in New York City. And to be clear, that's not my language. The language of anti-Trump protests comes directly from this ICE document. And that's really significant. This is not suggested that it is a public safety risk, that there was any concern about unlawful activity or even immigration-related activity. The protests included on this list were 100% protected speech by members of the public speaking about matters of policy, and specifically matters of policy where they oppose the Trump regime. And in particular, when we're talking about immigration activists, they have every right to speak out publicly about the abject cruelty of the Trump administration's deportation machine and its treatment of immigrants here throughout the country. So this spreadsheet is unbelievably troubling because it demonstrates that our immigration authorities have not only gone outside of their authority to deal with immigration enforcement, they have not only gone outside of their mandate as law enforcement to protect public safety, but they are monitoring completely protected, they are monitoring constitutionally protected activity, speech and protest that is at the very core of our Constitution protections. So not only is this not a matter of public safety, it is an example of law enforcement monitoring and, I think very troublingly, investigating people for their constitutionally protected speech.
What happens next? Is there going to be any sort of legal action? Because it seems a lot of, I've talked to Ravi Ragbear, I talked to some folks from Rise and Resist, and they say, and I'm from my own experience as a reporter, they were obviously following me, I know that, I could tell you about that later. Where do we go now from that?
Well, actually, there already are legal actions on this issue that I think suggest that this kind of enforcement is on constitutionally very thin ice. Just a few months ago, the Supreme Court issued a ruling saying that law enforcement may not retaliate against someone and use their protected speech or belief as the main reason for arrest. The Supreme Court actually overturned the arrest of someone who, by the way, did break the law, and where the cops had claimed some degree of probable cause simply because the cops targeted him without question because of his protected speech. He was kind of a gadfly and had annoyed the police officers, and they decided to basically make an example out of him. The Supreme Court rightly said, our First Amendment prevents you from doing law enforcement that way. Law enforcement is about public safety, and in order for our constitutional promise of free speech to be respected, if it means anything, it means that cops can't decide who they arrest and who they don't based on that person's speech or beliefs. So we now have a very strong case at the Supreme Court that's recent that gives pretty clear direction to police that targeting someone's beliefs and opinions is not a proper method of law enforcement, period, full stop. In addition, the Second Circuit Federal Court, which is the federal court that governs New York, in addition to other states, is taking up an appeal by Ravi Ragbear, who you mentioned, who is an anti-ICE activist, someone who has opposed the Trump regime's cruel deportation regime, and has been singled out for deportation hearings, for deportation, because of his outspoken activism. Ravi's attorneys have filed an appeal at the Second Circuit that the court heard at the end of 2018, and we're still waiting for an opinion there. The NYCLU and other groups filed briefs, friend of the court briefs with the court, arguing that that kind of policing, that is targeting someone for arrest or deportation solely because of their speech, violates the First Amendment. And especially with this Supreme Court case in the background, I'm confident and hopeful that Mr. Ragbir will prevail. So, of course, all we have here, just to be clear, that the nation has uncovered is a spreadsheet. And nowhere on the spreadsheet has anyone put something in writing. No one at least has been so foolish that I've seen that says, because of this protest, we're going to arrest this person. But it also is impossible to look at this spreadsheet in a vacuum. We have several years now of evidence of ICE targeting immigration advocates, including in the city of New York, including Ravi Ragbir. So I think this is powerful evidence for those who attended these rallies that they have gotten onto ICE's radar, not because they present any public safety risk, not because they are part of normal day-to-day immigration enforcement, but precisely because of that protected behavior. So I think ICE is really in hot water here because there are a number of people who can now point to this and say, this is why I was picked up, not for any legitimate law enforcement or immigration enforcement reason.
Lee Rowland is Policy Director of the New York Civil Liberties Union. On February 14, 2018, immigrant rights advocates with the New Sanctuary Coalition held an Ash Wednesday demonstration outside the ICE offices at 26 Federal Plaza in Manhattan. The protesters plan to offer ashes, as per Christian tradition, to all who pass by as a symbol of solidarity with immigrants facing deportation. An email exchange between the Deputy Field Director of ICE's New York Field Office and the Assistant Field Office Director, whose names have been redacted, shows that the officials were well aware of the planned demonstration. The Ash Wednesday protest, quote, saves us the trip of going over to the church, wrote the Assistant Field Office Director in a February 14th email. He said, I certainly hope they, the immigrant rights activists, won't discriminate against ICE officers. I'll pass, the Deputy Director responded, implying that he would not accept ashes from the religiously minded protesters. Several months later, in a July 24, 2018 email, the Deputy Field Office Director of ICE's New York Field Office, whose name has been redacted, sent an email to a number of top local ICE officials and what appear to be multiple ICE listservs, including one titled #IceWatch Event Notification, in order to provide agency personnel with information about an upcoming protest in front of ICE's office in Manhattan. The protest, dubbed the Deportee Suitcase Solidarity March, was organized by the New Solidarity Coalition. Ravi Ragbir is director of the organization, and he spoke with WBAI earlier today.
We have a program, an accompaniment program, where we partner U.S. citizens with non-citizens who have to interact with immigration enforcement. Immediately after the training, every single aspect of our training, they countered the role of our volunteers, our citizen volunteers. So we suspected that, and this is confirmation of that suspect. It is very distressing, though, to know that the agency is surveilling us and surveilling all organizations like this. But what is even more distressing is that they actually the spreadsheet didn't say anti-ICE protest. It says anti-Trump protest. So that is very disconcerting to know that who is this agency report to? Who is this agency? Are they for the America, or is it for the president?
Do you think that they actually had infiltrators in your training sessions?
We believe they had infiltrators at the training. We also believe that they have had infiltrators at our protests and our rallies and vigils. They speak about having someone, especially at our suitcase rally, they were part of. Yes, we believe, and these documents, it does not explicitly show that there's infiltrators, but it definitely points in that direction.
What was the purpose of the suitcase rally that was surveilled?
Most people, unfortunately not all, when they are getting deported, their loved one is allowed to prepare a suitcase that is 25 pounds in weight, that the person can take with them when they're deported to the country. So the suitcase rally was, what would you pack for your loved one? Only 25 pounds. Obviously, you can't pack much. So what was it that was so important that you will want to send with your loved one when they're exiled? So there was a huge emotional connection. We believe that they were walking around in and around the protest.
what effect on your movement, on your organization, does this knowledge, when it comes out that you're being...
Yes, this would normally be a chilling effect because it goes back to the McCarthyism, right, where you are being checked and surveilled, COINTELPRO, you are being checked by this agency. It should have a chilling effect because even though this president is talking about writing an executive order to protect free speech in college for conservatives, yet he wants to clamp down on free speech from other citizens who disagree with him. So there's a hypocrisy of this president. Why is it that ICE is doing the administration's dirty work? This is an agency that is supposed to be focused on non-citizens. The jurisdiction is on citizens, but yet they are surveilling citizens. And this goes back to the fact that this agency is a plenary agency, which means that they have very little oversight by Congress and by the courts. So they can do a lot of dirty work without being punished, without facing the word recrimination. We need to be concerned when there is an agency like this, especially with this administration, who is focused on ethnic cleansing.
Ravi Ragbear is director of the New Sanctuary Coalition. The July 24th ICE email, which was sent to the Deputy Field Office Director and labeled confidential and high importance, contained detailed information gleaned from the Deportee Suitcase Solidarity March's Facebook page. This information included the number of people who had signed up on Facebook to attend the event, a description of the event, and the name of the sponsors, like the Legal Aid Society and the New Sanctuary Coalition. And here in the United States, the government kept a database on journalists, activists, organizers, and instigators, in their words, during an investigation into last year's migrant caravan, infuriating civil liberties and media groups who called it a blatant violation of free speech rights. U.S. Customs and Border Protection compiled information on dozens of people that included passport and social media photos, dates of birth, personal information, and their suspected role in the caravans that were coming from Central America to the U.S. border. Some of the people on the list were denied entry into Mexico and had their passports flagged or visas revoked. The database was revealed Wednesday by the San Diego TV station KNSD. People listed in the documents provided to the station included 10 journalists, many of whom are U.S. citizens, and an American attorney. There were several dozen people in all on the list, including many labeled as instigators. And on Wednesday, The Nation reported that immigration rights activists in New York City had been surveilled by immigration police and a previously little-known agency called Homeland Security Investigations. The Nation released internal emails gotten through the Freedom of Information Act that showed officials had kept close tabs on activists, including a sitting congressional representative. And the National Security Agency spying program to analyze logs of the domestic calls and texts of U.S. citizens is reportedly no longer in use, and the legislation which made it legal may not be renewed when it expires at the end of the year. The NSA's mass monitoring of logs of phone calls and texts related to U.S. citizens first began in 2006, some 5 years after the 9/11 attacks. The program was revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013 and was later declared illegal by a federal appeals court. The senior staff attorney for the Electronic Frontier Foundation is Andrew Crocker. He says while news that the NSA will not ask for extension of the program is good, little is known about what might replace it.
The law that they use to do this data collection, Section 215 of the Patriot Act, expires at the end of this year, and what the staffer said was they're not going to push for it to be reauthorized. The program was famously revealed by Edward Snowden and written about in The Guardian in 2013, that the NSA was collecting in bulk telephone records on a daily basis of most or all phone calls made inside the United States and going out of the United States. That was reined in somewhat in 2015 by Congress, but what we've learned in the last year or so is that they're still collecting millions and millions of telephone records, 530 million in 2017 alone.
And these are from Americans?
Yes.
So how do they collect this? Remind us how it's done.
Prior to the passage of that law in 2015, the way it was done was the NSA would go to the FISA court and get orders to telephone companies to turn over these records on a daily basis. So an order to Verizon is actually Verizon, a subsidiary of Verizon, is what Snowden first revealed to The Guardian. It was published in 2013. After the passage of this law in 2015, they changed the program a little bit, and now those orders are issued to the telephone companies, and they don't turn over the records preemptively. They're just turning over records using seed numbers about which the NSA is using as a target, and they get all of the numbers that target has called, and then all of the numbers that the target's contacts have called. So they call that 2 hops out. And as I said, that's resulted in even so the collection of hundreds of millions of records a year.
Second, what is that? The second degree of connection is equal to millions and millions of people. Amazing.
Yeah.
And where does this information go? Where do they store it? And then what do they do with it?
We don't know everything they do with it. We know that it goes into a centralized database and that they run queries on these databases when they're beginning investigations. And that's sort of what allows them to go deeper. If they have suspicion about this one number, as I mentioned, and they have everyone's contacts and the contacts in the database, if they come up in response to search, they can then open a sort of a fuller investigation and look into other databases where they might have so-called incidentally collected those people's actual communications, that instead of just the records of their calls, the actual content of emails and conversations. So it's sort of the starting point for deeper investigations, usually, we think.
What will happen next, do you think?
It's really a quickly evolving thing. And as you already mentioned, the New York Times report about this staffer saying that it's been stopped is surprising. I think that it's very likely that either the NSA will say they still need this provision even if they're not using it currently, or in reality they're doing something else that substitutes for this program, and that they're perfectly happy to let it expire because they've got a similar capability somewhere else in the law. So one of the things that we're really focusing on, asking the public and certainly asking Congress to do, is to get more information about this so that we can be satisfied that they're following the laws that do exist and that they're not going beyond those bounds of that, which is where these hundreds of millions of records come from.
Is the Fourth Amendment dead for all practical purposes? Should it be just ripped out of the Constitution, or do we have a chance of getting back some of the freedoms we used to have?
I don't think the Fourth Amendment is dead by any stretch. The Supreme Court's recent case law has made very clear that they're going to be protective of privacy and of the Fourth Amendment against the encroachment of technology. So even as we all become more reliant on technology, and it is very convenient in many respects, it does come with these risks of collection of data by third parties, and of course that being available to the government. And at least on the Fourth Amendment side, on the government side, the Supreme Court has made very clear that we can't just revert to the way things were before, and we can't just say, if you pass it over to third parties, you're screwed, you don't have any privacy. They've said, no, you can still have privacy in records held by these companies. And I think that's a very good thing, and it's really the direction the court is taking. And so I actually have real faith in the viability of the Fourth Amendment going forward.
And that was Andrew Crocker, Senior Staff Attorney for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And in New York, U.S. Magistrate Gabriel Gorenstein said he wouldn't be jailing immigration activist Patricia Okoumou ahead of her March 19th sentencing for climbing the Statue of Liberty on the 4th of July. Instead, he ordered that she be confined to her home with electronic monitoring. Patricia Okoumou had scaled the Statue of Liberty in protest of the Trump administration's separation of immigrant families. She was found guilty of various trespassing charges. Today's court appearance came on the heels of her arrest last week in Austin, Texas, for scaling another building in protest, an action that prosecutors say violated the terms of her bail. In Austin, she scaled a building that belonged to Southwest Key, an organization housing detained immigrant children. The company was founded by Juan Sanchez, a former farm worker who the New York Times wrote built an empire using detained immigrant children as bricks. Okoumou, wearing a pink jacket emblazoned with the words "Columbus didn't discover America," spoke outside the courtroom before going in.
The people who are in cages, these children, are prisoners. They're in prison. They don't have the freedom to go outside. When I went to Paris, yes, I did climb the Eiffel Tower, but I did also investigate, and I asked people over there, is this what you do in your country? Do you have cages? They say, no, we have hotels where we send immigrants we cannot identify. We give them some form of ID so they can integrate within our community and find sustainable housing and shelter for themselves. So why are we putting people in cages? And then profiteers are making money off of it. It's not okay with me, and it shouldn't be okay with you guys. So I have on my page an endorsement page. I want people to endorse me publicly because I'm not getting a lot of support as it should. What I mean by that, if you look at the videos or how many people come here, the number should have been higher. If you look at the magnitude of my action on the 4th of July, and you check my GoFundMe account, it's on life support. So for a woman who stands up for what's right, people should rally for my freedom and in solidarity with the children.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good luck. Are your attorneys here yet?
I don't know. I haven't seen them.
Hi,
Hi, Paul. How are you?
How you doing? Great.
Good.
What do you feel about what's about to happen here? What's going through your mind right now?
What's going into my mind is that the world is watching us, and they've been laughing at us all along. It's about time we do things right. It's about time we save our democracy and stand up for basic human rights, such as saving these children in cages.
What are you going to tell the judge when you go in there?
I don't anticipate to tell the judge anything. I believe that his moral compass would judge him and his decision. I'm here to stand for my own moral compass, which tells me the country needs to be saved because we have stood so low that I have to climb monuments such as the Statue of Liberty to raise consciousness.
If the worst case scenario happens and they put you in jail, what do you think that's going to mean? What message do you think that'll send?
The message that will send is that we have a lot of work to do. We have not gotten even near reaching democracy. I do not belong in a cage, and many people know that. And when I'm put in a cage, I want my friends and supporters to know that I would begin my hunger strike. Because I'm in business, I'm serious about the work that I'm doing. I'm not looking for fame. I'm looking to highlight the broken immigration system we have and calling out on profiteers such as Juan Sanchez and asking members of the public, congressmen, public figures, religious leaders to stand up with me in this cause and free the migrant children.
How long would you go on hunger strike for?
Until I die. That's what the hunger strike is for. I mean, I could have died on the Statue of Liberty. When people minimize my action and they think it's glamorous or entertaining, they forget the point. When there is infighting amongst ourselves, they're not thinking about the children. So I want to be remembered as someone who sacrificed their lives for the migrant children, not someone who just climbed the Statue of Liberty.
You think the judge might now lock you up because you said that?
I don't talk about what the judge is going to do or not do. It's not my place. He's got a job to do, and he made it clear on December 17 that he has a job to do. Today and on March 19, because they are still going to be sentencing on March 19, the judge will get to show the world what his moral compass is. That's all I can say.
And in front of a courtroom packed with supporters, Assistant U.S. Attorney Brett Calico asked Gorenstein to detain her until she is sentenced as a result of violating a condition of bail that required her not to break any federal, state, or local law. She was arrested for trespass by Austin police and released, but has not been convicted. Defense attorney Ron Kuby argued that all Okoumou was guilty of was shining a light, exposing the worst recesses of American society. The prosecutor also made a cryptic reference to Okoumou's Thanksgiving Day attempt to climb the Eiffel Tower in Paris that got her thrown into jail for a week and then expelled from France. The judge denied prosecutors' request to jail Okoumou ahead of her March 19th sentencing on the Statue of Liberty climbing charge, but followed a sentencing recommendation that she be fitted with a GPS monitor on an ankle bracelet and limited to travel in the 5 boroughs of New York City. When she's sentenced, Okoumou faces anything from no jail time to 18 months. Outside the courtroom, sporting her new jewelry, Okoumou addressed reporters with her lawyers Ron Kuby and Ria Triveldi.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ron Kuby. Patricia Okoumou, you know, and my associate and one of Patricia's lawyers, Ria Triveldi. Ms. Okoumou is walking out of court today with a piece of jewelry she did not have when she walked in. She's been fitted with an ankle monitoring and has been ordered confined to her home until the date of sentencing. Obviously, we are happy that the court rejected the crazy notion that she is a danger to the community. We're happy that the judge chose not to incarcerate her over the objections of the government. We are unhappy about the fact that we have to be here in the first place. I just want to say to my colleagues in the media, especially MSNBC and New York Times writers, to the extent anybody thinks that the Southern District of New York operates independently from the Trump White House and the Trump Justice Department, it doesn't. The federal prosecutors today who sought to detain Ms. Okoumou are just fingers on the very small hands of the Trump administration doing their work the way he wants it done. I know Ms. Trivedi has a couple of words. I'm sure Ms. Okoumou has something to say, and then we're all going home.
No, just a simple point that restraint is a measure of good government. And Judge Gorenstein, we're grateful that Judge Gorenstein demonstrated some restraint by not incarcerating Ms. Okoumou today, but not nearly as much restraint as he could have, and thus enabling the retaliatory agenda of the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is part of the same administration, part of the same agency that conducted the zero-tolerance policy of family separation that Ms. Okoumou was protesting in the first place.
I would like to say follow the money. Go after Secretary of Education, Bessie DeVos, because she's been linked to this adoption agency called Bethany Adoption Services. Follow the money. When the Trump administration claims they don't know where the children are, or they have no ability to reunite them with their families because some of them have already been deported, the truth is, and we're not stupid, you cannot lose human beings. They have a mechanism to make money off of these children. It was intended from the get-go. That's why they're not giving us the numbers. That's why they haven't been transparent. And my work here will continue as far as my activism, highlighting the atrocity of this administration. This administration is vile, and it will continue to be vile. But one day, with act of activism, bravery, the world will know that these children will have to walk out free. One of these days, my goal is that the children will be free and liberated from this rotten system, this criminal enterprise. They need to go after CEO Juan Sanchez, the man responsible for most of these detention centers, like the one at Southwest Key in Austin, Texas. Investigate them, follow the money.
Mr. Riley has a pointed, obnoxious question, but a relevant one.
It is relevant. Will you promise to not break the law anymore?
No comment. How's that for an answer?
You said before going into court that you would go on a hunger strike if you were incarcerated. Do you consider this incarceration still? Do you still plan to carry out that plan, or?
I do not consider this incarceration. I think if the Trump administration, his cronies and apologists want to find some kind of satisfaction, they got it today. And let them rejoice. But the people know what the truth is, what I stand for. I stand on the right side of history. History would judge our conduct. History would judge this court. History would judge the judge and the system. We are facing hard times, guys. And people like me, civilians, performing the civic duties have to be applauded for the work that we are doing. This is not an easy job to go after the government that is criminalizing babies. These detention centers are creating an environment where the children are at risk because you have babies changing diapers. I mean, it's atrocity to describe the amount of physical abuse these children are going through. We are losing babies in custody. We're not going to forget the children they are killing. That's why I speak for the voiceless, because we're not going to wait for them to be eradicated on the face of this earth. They're in the concentration camps, and I am treating it as such. We are facing a humanitarian crisis. These children are being drugged, they are being manipulated, they are being treated unhumanely. And so they are being deprived of their basic human rights. That's what I'm fighting for.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah, the judge made it interesting. He compared what Patricia was doing to what would I do if anti-abortion protesters did the same thing. And I thought that was an interesting comparison.
Well, I think the judge's position is to take away the moral qualities of the acts that are being committed and just try to pretend that he's simply applying facially neutral laws to a lawbreaker without regard to the cause. The fundamental problem with that is that it's not a question of my values or our values or the judge's values versus somebody else's values. America has values. At least America has aspirations to values. And those aspirations mean that the people who are fighting against bigotry, against discrimination, are fighting against child separation, are fighting against incarceration, they do not stand on the same moral footing as the bigots and the racists and the anti-Semites among us. Because it's not a question of one person's set of values versus another person's set of values. It's an issue of America's values. And Patricia and her comrades stand squarely on the side of the most cherished values of this free society, of inclusion, of diversity, of tolerance. And those are not equal in any sense to bigotry and hatred.
What about the judge saying that she could only make money by protesting? I wanted to get your response to that, but by breaking the law.
But that's, I mean, just as a technical matter, I mean, Patricia Okoumou worked for a very long time before she became a full-time activist. And she is a full-time activist, so she's supported by donations the way most full-time activists are supported. Let's face it, being an advocate against forcible family separation is not a job that somebody can apply for and receive funds for. So she does indeed exist on the basis of donations that people give her. But the judge got it exactly reversed. It is the donations that support her activism. She doesn't engage in her activism for donations. There are easier ways. There are easier ways to make a living than risking jail every single day. All right, comrades, love you all. March 19th, be there or be square.
Thank you.
Attorney Ron Kuby, the physically fit activist, Okoumou says, that's how I do my activism. I climb things. You've been listening to The Torch on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm your host, Paul DiRienzo.